One particular partner of UNSW is Global Voices. So this is a non-for-profit that does really great work. So you can see down the bottom, they have a pretty good track record. But what they basically do, their main aim is to identify and develop young leaders across the board. And they try to give them foreign policy and international experience. So I was actually lucky enough to be selected for the Global Voices Scholarship, and I guess that's why I'm here talking to you today. This scholarship has basically three main legs. So the leg on the right is the research fellowship. There's a pre-departure session in Canberra, and the opportunity to represent Australia at the Y20, which will become much clearer when I get to that slide. Cool, so I'll just jump in. So I might start with the Canberra pre-departure briefing first. So what this was a tribe to achieve, so this was before I went to Japan, and what they were trying to do is basically get us ready for Japan, make sure they're building up the kind of leadership traits that they want to see in us, get us exposed to understanding multilateral, domestic and international negotiations, how that actually works, or what we should be doing and looking for. And also just the experience of meeting other there was about 10 other scholars from across Australia that were in the program. And I guess just interacting with people like that and just hearing their ideas from different areas, so they weren't all finance related, some for medicine and all that kind of background. So it was really seeing how people with the same kind of engagement but from different backgrounds think in a different way, but they're kind of all going for the same outcomes. It's pretty wonderful. And the kind of main way we did that was meeting with a lot of senior leaders in the public sector. So probably elaborate more in the next slide. Cool, so these are some of the organisations that we had a chance to meet with. So you'll see most of them are public sector organisations. They're pretty hopefully recognisable across the board. And they're kind of the ones that keep Australia running, which is pretty wonderful. So this was really cool, and actually on the next page we have a list of who we actually met. Yeah. And this was really eye-opening for me. So you probably see a lot of directors and that kind of names on there. And just to be in the same room as these people and hear the way they think, their experiences and what they've been through was phenomenal. I think also the part that stood out to me was the most that most of them were driven by the same cause of trying to make Australia a better place for tomorrow, but all of them saw the problem in a different light. They came at it with a different set of expertise, different problem, different way of finding the solution. And I guess the key takeaway for me was that no matter what your skill is, no matter what your area of expertise, there's always a way you can contribute, so you should never really feel like you can't. And I guess seeing them overwhelmingly, and they all talk, they were very like, I guess if you saw them in the street, the thing that overwhelmed me is that you wouldn't really think anything of them, but once you saw them with their hat and talking in a professional lens, you were just wowed by them, so that's really cool. So when we were talking with a lot of these leaders, I thought I'd summarize some of the common concerns that were coming up across the board, and I tried to group them into the most logical kind of ways I could see them. So from a society perspective, so I guess all of us as active citizens, they mentioned that lack of political engagement, and I guess polarization and institutional trust falling, not just in Australia, across the board, internationally. But that was one of the things they mentioned was a serious concern. Not to mention the media cycles, so given single issues dominating media cycles that overload, so when you get too much, you kind of start zoning it out, you don't take all of it in. And minority groups having a majority say, and then a lot of neutral people going actually quiet, and then you kind of get a bit of a skewed perspective, and it's very easy to tune out, so that kind of leads into the disengagement piece. And in politics, I'm sure anyone who watches the news, there's a lot of short-term actions that kind of lead to poor outcomes, and the more that goes on, the kind of less constructive it gets. And I tried to include, I guess, so we actually had a chance to meet with the director of research at the ABS, and they were reflecting on what they learned from the census and how some of that had a few technical issues. And one of the key learnings I got from that was actually they mentioned that they had all the technical capabilities, but what they overlooked was having the social license to actually manage people's data, their trust, and the rest of that piece. So I guess as Westpac, as a very key part of the Australian culture and making people feel safe and welcome, it's not only important that we have the technical feasibilities, but we also make sure that people feel that they can trust us. And I guess that ties in very much with the service promise and where we're going, but yeah, so something to keep in mind. Cool, so now on to the Y20. So what it is basically the G20 has, which is starting today actually in Osaka in Japan, which is pretty exciting. They actually have 8 engagement groups which they get information from. So think tanks, scientists, businesses, that kind of thing. One of those think tanks is the Youth 20. So they basically gather youth delegates from all the G20 countries and they come together to try to solve international problems, but from a youth perspective. So that's what we were there to do. Cool. So myself and Rosanna in the picture there, we were selected to represent Australia, which is pretty exciting. And we were speaking on these three topics. So the future of work and international trade, I was speaking on those topics, and Rosanna was talking about business and environment. So the way it worked was before we went, we actually submitted a lot of policy proposals. We read all the other countries and we kind of did an informal voting session to figure out what our priorities were, because naturally our problems are not the same problems shared by all the G20 countries. And then once we actually got there for the summit, each topic was allocated a day and a half. So the way that worked is, this was chunked into 3 parts. So the first section was basically bring out, for each topic there was obviously 20 policies, so bringing 20 policies into 3, there's a lot of discussion and negotiation that goes along with that. And it was basically the idea of figuring out what's our biggest problem, and then what's our biggest solution from a kind of international lens. Once you get past that stage, the next one was basically breaking off into kind of working groups, fleshing out those 3 policies in terms of content, content, wording, and the kind of the main gist. And then in the third section, we'd all come back together and we'd basically have all 20 countries come together and agree on exact wording that would come out and communicate. That actually sounded very simple to me before I went there. I realised it is not, for many reasons, which I've tried to outline here. People are very different, and they have very different interests from different countries, and I guess hopefully that gives you a good list. But what I didn't realise is even something as simple as, I'll give you an example, the definition of youth. So in a place like Japan, where their average age is close to 80, it's very high, they were pushing for the definition of youth to go to 40. Whereas in Saudi Arabia, with the average lifespan of 50, they were pushing for the more 25 range. So even something as simple as youth, and when you look at it from both of their perspectives, they're very valid reasons for doing it. It's not really irrational or anything like that, but when you try to create a global consensus, you're going to have conflict. And that's something as kind of menial as something like this. Imagine when you're actually talking about topics which have impacts for real people and that kind of thing. So if you imagine this blown up in every single other part of the negotiations, that's kind of, you get a flavour of what's going on. So kind of surprised me that things get done at all rather than, But it was a really great experience to see how people work together and they kind of make compromises. And I think one of the overwhelming things I learned from this process was a lot of the reasons leaders that we talked to commented on the fact that youth, I guess we bended with logic because we didn't have national interests tying us down the same way real G20 leaders may have, because obviously when they say something, it means they're putting their money where their mouth is. So some of the other experiences we got to do there was really incredible. So they really went above and beyond with their hospitality. They took us to tea ceremonies, national parks. They showed us private shogun ceremonies, which is like a traditional samurai comedy show kind of thing. They took us to very exclusive clubs. It was pretty amazing. We went to lunch at the Australian Embassy. But I think probably the biggest takeaway for me was the people I met there. I mean, they were just phenomenal. And everyone they picked, I was one of the youngest ones there, to be honest, but most of them were doing masters or some kind of public policy work already, and they were very driven. They're obviously there for a reason, and just engaging with them, it was very similar to what I got in Canberra, but I guess it was from a different international mindset as well. So I guess we're pretty homogenous in Australia in the way we think and the cultural values we have, but when you start to see things from a different lens like that, but with the same drive, it's very eye-opening. Cool. So I guess what is the point of all this that I did? The biggest takeaway would be the policy document that the G20 leaders would be using today to kind of get an idea of what the youth care about for the problems that we were trying to address. It was really cool because we got the chance to present the Y20 communique to Shinzo Abe and his wife the next day at their residency. It was really interesting to note actually when we did that it's a very fine line when you're the youth getting caught between being realistic and idealistic, because it's very easy to get written off. So one of the things we did, we actually toned a lot of our language down and we made things more practical than visionary, because we thought it's very easy. That's why we made our thing very concise, given there's 8 groups. People aren't going to have time to read massive pages. You want to get to the point and you want to make it work. So actually he made a point to call that out, and he said he really liked how it was able to be implemented, it was practical. But on the flip side of that, we actually talked to the youth minister, and he said, I wish you'd been bolder. So it's kind of, you kind of see two sides of the same thing, but I think we got what we were hoping for, but it was interesting to see that other people wish we'd done more because we had, I guess, the right to say more, because we're one of the few people who could demand like that. Yeah, so also when we got back, we got the chance to send correspondence to our Prime Minister and G20 Sherpa, which is pretty cool. And I guess from here, the next stage will basically be going around spreading awareness, making sure that people know about it, not only for this purpose, but I think as someone who's been privileged enough to go and speak on behalf of other people, it's important that you pay that forward so people not only know what was said, but also they know about the same opportunity and they could feel, you know, that do it for the next few years. Cool. That experience was phenomenal. It was literally life-changing for me. So when I thought about my key learnings, I could not fit it on one slide. So I tried to make it as relevant as possible for this crowd. Given that many people are still in the youth bracket, especially if you take the Japanese definition, or you have youth in your own. Yeah, but I realised that one of the main problems for youth is that, again, like I said, it's very easy to get written off as idealistic or lack of expertise in a certain field or something like that. But what happens is that a lot of youth lack representation in global governance. But the thing is, we still have to live with the consequences of other people's actions for the rest of our lives. I guess that would be the core problem. So I guess the solution would be to know that, like I've had the opportunity today, there's always a way to get your voice heard. You just have to push hard enough and go for it fast enough. That being said, though, just shouting doesn't make any sense. You have to do it with, rational, expert logic. You have to be measured, and you have to say something that matters. And I think it's important that we recognise that we're actually in a very privileged position in that a lot of the barriers to entry, because of better tech and that kind of thing, we can actually spread our voice a lot quicker than other generations ever could, even if they felt the same way. So we have kind of an onus to make good on that. And at the same time, not only us, but I think if institutions, major societies kind of recognise that people are, especially youth, not just advocating and shouting, but going about it in a measured and correct way, that they support that and give opportunities like this for me to tell you what I've done across the board. So I think that's really great that I'm even allowed to speak here today. So thank you. Cool. And then on to my third item. So part of the research fellowship, what they're aiming to do here was basically pick a topic that you care about and best case scenario get it so that you can actually get past it law when you finish writing it. So I'm still in draft mode, so if any of you have any ideas, criticisms, please talk to me at the end. I would love your feedback. Cool. So the general idea is working on wage transparency as a way to improve labour market conditions. So just as a show of hands, has anybody heard of pay scale or Glassdoor? Just so I have an idea. Okay, cool. So yeah. So the general idea of what I was thinking was very simple in terms of regulation change. It would just be that when people put their payroll into the ATO, they would just add a few bits of extra information, and those extra bits of information should hopefully explain how compensation is derived to a certain degree. And then in a similar way to this is done, so there's kind of a box and whisker plot, you get the lowest, you get the mean, you get the max, you get kind of how the compensation is broken down. But beyond that, so you can see here, I don't know if you can read, it says city, experience, skill, and employer, but I don't think that really encompasses why compensation is set the way it is. So I guess including things like your, yeah, so maybe just keep that visual in mind, and I'll go to the next page where I have some of the variables broken down. Well, what it would be is just collecting more information as part of the ATO and then sharing that in a format like this where it's all anonymized, where people can hopefully get a benchmark of what their market rate is for their actual position based on their skill set and personal circumstance. Yeah, so like I said before, these are just some of the variables that would be there, things like the risk weighting of your job, the outcome, and that should hopefully decide what you should be getting paid. And so the next page should help us understand why this is happening. So basically, because of the taboo around compensation in Australia, it's kind of ended, people aren't that comfortable talking about it. And then with that, it's kind of grown a information asymmetry going forward. And this has kind of eroded a bit of employee bargaining power. So not that this will save anything, but I guess people who might be being taken advantage of or have no idea about their true market rate, especially given that things like pay scale are private organisations and they're kind of on a good faith basis of putting your information up. Whereas this way would just be government mandated, so you definitely would have access to more accurate and reliable data, so you kind of had a benchmark. Okay, cool. I'll figure this up. Anyway, so there's a few other reasons. There's a few other reasons I've put it there, but I'm happy to go into more detail later. Yeah. And summary, yeah. So, quick follow-up. So if you want to see what the actual communique is, what the G20 leaders will be looking at, it's just 4 pages, and you can go to that link up the top. If you have any other questions about the communique or the draft, or even how, if you have kids that want to get involved or anything like that, I'm more than happy to answer questions or that kind of thing. I'm being shy, so I'll be quick. Yeah, thank you.